In 1888, a 16-year-old girl named Ada Nield walked into a corset factory in Crewe and began the most important job of her life. Not the job of sewing corsets. That she would do for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages so low that she calculated she could not afford to eat a proper meal on a workday. The most important job she did in that factory was watching, listening, writing down in careful detail everything she saw. 3 years later, in 1894, she published her observations in a series of anonymous letters to the local newspaper. She signed them only as a Crewe Factory Girl. And what she described, the 14-hour days, the fines for talking, the meals taken standing at the workroom table, the wages that worked out to less than a penny an hour, reached a public that had heard statistics about factory conditions before, but had never heard a factory girl describe her own life in her own words. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel tells the buried stories of the Victorian era, the ones that didn't make it into the official record. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this video earns it, a like means everything to a small channel. Now, back to 1894, and the women whose working lives Victorian Britain preferred not to examine too closely. The story of Victorian women and work is not the story that Victorian society told about itself. The official story was one of separate spheres: men in the public world of commerce and politics, women in the private world of home and family. This story was, for the vast majority of Victorian women, a fiction. Working-class women had always worked. They worked in factories, in domestic service, in laundries, in dressmaking workshops, in market stalls, in the fields during harvest, in the informal economy of taking in lodgers and doing neighbors' mending. The notion that women belong
in the domestic sphere was an aspiration of the middle class, an ideal that required sufficient income to keep a wife at home, which most Victorian working-class families did not have. What changed in the Victorian era was not whether women worked, but where they worked and under what conditions. The industrial economy drew women out of domestic and agricultural work and into factories, workshops, and commercial establishments in unprecedented numbers. By the middle of the 19th century, women constituted a significant proportion of the industrial workforce in textiles, clothing, ceramics, food processing, and a dozen other industries. And they were paid, systematically and by design, less than men doing equivalent work. The wage gap in Victorian Britain was not incidental. It was structural. It was justified by a web of arguments that the Victorian era constructed with considerable ingenuity: that women worked only temporarily until they married, that women's wages were supplementary to a male breadwinner's income rather than primary earnings, that women's work was inherently less skilled than men's, and therefore worth less, regardless of what the actual skill level of the work was. These arguments were largely false. Many women who worked in Victorian factories were not temporary workers supporting themselves until marriage. They were permanent workers who needed their wages to survive. Many were widows or women whose husbands were absent, ill, or unemployable. Many were the primary or sole earners for their families. And the claim that women's work was inherently less skilled than men's was applied even in industries where women performed identical tasks, or where the specific skills the work required were ones women demonstrably possessed. The dressmaking and millinery trades, the industries that made the elaborate clothing that Victorian fashion required, were staffed almost entirely by women and girls, many of them highly skilled by any reasonable standard. The dressmakers who produced gowns for wealthy clients were craftswomen whose work required years of training, precise technical skill, and aesthetic judgment. They were paid a fraction of what male craft workers in other industries earned for comparable levels of skill. In the dress trade, the specific conditions of employment added additional cruelty to the low wages. The season,
The period around major social events, when wealthy clients needed new clothes quickly, meant that dressmaking establishments ran around the clock during the London season, with workers sleeping on the premises in shifts, sewing through the night to meet deadlines. The mortality rate among young dressmakers from tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases was documented and was extraordinarily high, a direct consequence of working in poorly ventilated rooms for extremely long hours. The report on the conditions of dressmakers, produced by a parliamentary inquiry in the 1840s, described workshops in which girls as young as 13 or 14 worked through the night on
multiple consecutive occasions, sleeping for a few hours on the workroom floor, and then resuming. The inquiry found girls who had not left the premises for weeks, who had not seen daylight for days, whose physical condition showed the effects of chronic sleep deprivation and inadequate food. And yet, the dressmakers made the clothes that made the season possible. The gowns that the daughters of the same legislators who received this inquiry wore to the balls and presentations that were the central rituals of Victorian elite social life. The connection between the working conditions of the dressmakers and the social activities of their clients was direct and absolute, and it was almost never acknowledged. The Matchgirls Strike of 1888, which we have covered on this channel, showed what organized action by female workers could achieve. But the matchmakers were exceptional. They achieved their strike because they had a specific documented grievance, the phossy jaw, the disease that made their working conditions visibly, undeniably different from any acceptable standard, and because they had articulate outside support from Annie Besant and the wider reform movement. Most Victorian working women had no such support. The trade union movement of the Victorian era was, with some exceptions, a movement of skilled male workers. The structures, the culture, and the legal framework of trade unionism had been built by men, for men, in industries dominated by men. Women workers were often explicitly excluded from unions, or found themselves in industries where union organization had never been attempted. The Women's Protective and Provident League, founded by Emma Paterson in 1874, made the first sustained attempt to organize women workers into trade unions. Paterson's effort was contested at every level, by employers who threatened dismissal for union members, by male trade unionists who opposed women's organization on the grounds that women's lower wages undercut their own, and by a broader social environment that treated the idea of women organizing collectively to improve their conditions as slightly alarming. Emma Paterson died in 1886 at the age of 38, having established a foundation that would eventually, in the early 20th century, produce the first effective women's trade unions in Britain. She had spent her adult life building something she would not live to see succeed. The domestic servants, who made up the largest single category of female employment in Victorian Britain, occupied a particularly isolated position in this landscape. Domestic service employed more women than any other industry. By the mid-Victorian period, there were perhaps 1.5 million domestic servants in Britain, the vast majority of them female. Domestic servants could not be unionized. Their employment was in private households. Their relationship with their employers was personal and contractual in ways that made collective action essentially impossible. A housemaid who joined an organization of domestic servants and was discovered would be dismissed without reference, the most economically devastating outcome possible for a woman whose entire livelihood depended on maintaining a good character. The conditions of domestic service varied enormously between households. At the top, the large country houses and London townhouses of the aristocracy and gentry, service offered stable employment, adequate food, and a structured hierarchy that provided some protection. At the bottom, the single-servant households of the lower middle class, where one young girl did all the domestic labor for a family, conditions could be exploitative, isolating,
and occasionally abusive, with almost no recourse available to the servant who experienced them. What connected all these categories of Victorian working women, the factory girl and the dressmaker, the matchmaker and the domestic servant, was a structural vulnerability that the Victorian legal and political system did almost nothing to address. Women could not vote. This fundamental fact meant that the legislative process that governed their working conditions was carried out entirely by people who were not accountable to them. The reformers who advocated for better conditions for working women were in most cases men who did so from humanitarian conviction rather than political obligation. Their success depended on their ability to convince other men, legislators, editors, employers, rather than on any direct political pressure from the women themselves. Ada Nield understood this. After her letters were published, she became active in the labor movement and eventually in the suffrage movement because she had worked out, from direct experience, that without the vote, working women's ability to improve their own conditions was severely constrained. The connection between women's suffrage and women's labor rights was not abstract or theoretical. It was the lived conclusion of women who had tried to improve their working lives through the mechanisms available to them and found those mechanisms inadequate. The Victorian era ended without resolving the question. Women got limited voting rights in 1918 and full equal voting rights in 1928. The Equal Pay Act did not come until 1970. The wage gap between men
and women in Britain has not closed in the century and more since Ada Nield sat down at her workroom table and began to write. What she wrote, though, survived. Her letters were rediscovered by historians in the 20th century and are now recognized as a remarkable document, the voice of a working woman describing her own experience in her own words in the Victorian era, a voice that the official record almost lost. If the hidden histories of women's work matter to you, subscribe. Every week, we find the stories that were almost lost. Next week, the Victorian grave robbers, the men who dug up the dead and sold them to medical schools, and what happened when one of them decided it was easier to make fresh bodies than find old ones. See you then.